Welcome to the truth about Egypt and the Bible. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, it really does helps to build the channel. Introduction: Ancient Egypt. A land of golden deserts, mighty pharaohs, and monuments that have stood for thousands of years. But Egypt is also a place that looms large in another book, the Bible. From the story of Joseph rising from slave to Pharaoh's advisor, to the Israelites' suffering and miraculous escape, to Moses confronting the might of Egypt with plagues and prophecy, this civilization plays a starring role in some of the most powerful stories ever told. But here's the question: how much of it really happened? Did the Israelites actually live in Egypt in vast numbers? Was there truly an exodus, a mass departure that shook the greatest empire of its age? Could the dramatic plagues have natural explanations, or were they symbolic legends meant to teach lessons of faith? For centuries, scholars, archaeologists, and believers have debated, where does history end and myth begin? Today, we'll explore the evidence, inscriptions, ruins, ancient records, and modern science, to uncover the truth behind Egypt's role in the Bible. This isn't just a story of miracles and myths, it's the intersection of faith, history, and archaeology. And it might just change how you see one of the world's oldest and most enduring civilizations. Section 1: Joseph in Egypt. The story begins in Genesis with Joseph, the favored son, betrayed by his jealous brothers, sold into slavery, and carried to Egypt. From prisoner to dream interpreter, Joseph rises to become Pharaoh's trusted vizier, saving Egypt from famine and eventually reuniting with his family. But what does history say? Could this story reflect real events? Archaeology tells us that foreigners, especially Semitic people from Canaan, were living in Egypt as early as the Middle Kingdom, around 1900 BCE. In fact, some of them held high-ranking positions in Pharaoh's court. The Bible's Joseph, an outsider who became Pharaoh's right hand, mirrors this historical reality. We also know that Egypt's rulers sometimes relied on dream interpretation and divination, just as Joseph did. Ancient Egyptian texts even describe professional dream interpreters serving the palace. And then there's the famine. Egyptian inscriptions mention years of poor harvests and food shortages caused by the unpredictable Nile. One famous inscription, known as the famine Stele, tells of a 7-year famine during the reign of Pharaoh Joseph. Though written much later, it shows how deeply such disasters were etched into Egyptian memory, echoing the Bible's tale of Joseph storing grain. Still, there's a problem: no Egyptian record names Joseph directly. His story may not describe one man, but rather a memory of many foreign officials who rose to power during Egypt's long history. Whether Joseph was a single historical figure or a symbol of the immigrant experience, his story reflects a deeper truth: Egypt was a land where outsiders could fall into slavery, rise to greatness, and leave their mark on history. Section 2: The Israelites in Egypt. The book of Exodus paints a dramatic picture. The Israelites, once welcomed in Egypt, become so numerous that Pharaoh fears their growing strength. He enslaves them, forcing them into brutal labor until God raises up Moses to deliver them. But what do the records of ancient Egypt reveal? Archaeology shows that Semitic peoples, often called Asiatics, lived in the Nile Delta for centuries. Excavations at Avaris, the Hyksos capital in northern Egypt, reveal entire communities of people from Canaan who settled there as farmers, herders, and laborers. By the New Kingdom, especially under pharaohs like Seti I and Ramesses II, these communities grew in size and importance. The Bible describes the Israelites being forced to build store cities for Pharaoh, and here's where the story becomes intriguing. Ancient texts mention large building projects at Pi-Ramesses, the royal capital of Ramesses II. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of foreign workers, including Semitic people, laboring in these projects. This detail echoes the biblical narrative almost word for word. But were they slaves in the sense we imagine, whipped and chained day after day? Egyptian records complicate the picture. Most laborers were part of a corvée system, where citizens and foreigners alike were conscripted for state projects. Conditions were harsh. Workers lived in crowded camps and faced exhausting physical demands, but this wasn't permanent slavery for all. Still, it's possible that certain groups, like the Israelites, were treated more harshly, leaving a deep cultural memory of oppression. The challenge is silence. Egyptian records never mention the Israelites by name. Pharaohs rarely recorded defeats, disasters, or embarrassing events, only victories. If the Israelites were a small group within the vast sea of Egypt's labor force, their story might never have appeared in official inscriptions. So while the Bible speaks of an entire people enslaved, the reality may have been smaller groups of Semitic migrants, pressed into forced labor, whose story grew over generations into the epic saga of Exodus. Section 3. The plagues. Few stories in the Bible are as dramatic as the 10 plagues of Egypt. The Nile turning to blood. Frogs swarming the land. Darkness blotting out the sun. The death of the firstborn. Each one strikes at the heart of Egypt's survival and Pharaoh's power. But were these literal events, or did they grow from real natural disasters? Historians and scientists have long debated this. Some point to the eruption of the Santorini volcano around 1600 BCE. This massive explosion sent ash clouds across the Mediterranean, darkening skies, disrupting weather, and possibly even altering the Nile's ecosystem. Could this have inspired stories of darkness and chaos? Others suggest the Nile itself holds the answer. When certain red algae bloom in its waters, the river appears blood red. This kills fish and forces frogs onto land, leading to infestations. With the frogs gone, insects like gnats and flies would thrive unchecked, spreading disease. Livestock plagues and human illness could easily follow. Locust swarms, too, are a familiar menace in Egypt's history. In fact, ancient records outside the Bible describe locust plagues devastating crops and leaving famine in their wake. Even the final plague, the death of the firstborn, has been linked to possible food poisoning, where contaminated grain or disease struck hardest at the privileged classes who feasted first. Yet beyond science, the plagues carry a symbolic punch. Each plague seems to challenge Egypt's gods, the Nile god Hapi defeated when the waters turn red, the frog goddess Hecate mocked by frog infestations, the sun god Ra shamed by darkness. In this sense, the plagues were not just disasters, they were a divine contest, with the God of Israel defeating Egypt's deities one by one. Still, the historical record is silent. No Egyptian inscription speaks of such disasters, though this silence is not surprising. Pharaohs would never record humiliation. Whether natural disaster, myth, or a blend of both, the plagues remind us of Egypt's vulnerability. Even the mightiest empire could be brought to its knees by forces beyond its control. Section 4, The Exodus, Did It Happen? At the heart of the biblical story is the Exodus, a vast migration of Israelites leaving Egypt under Moses' leadership, pursued by Pharaoh's army, and crossing the Red Sea in one of the most dramatic escapes in all of literature. But did it really happen? For centuries, historians and believers have searched for proof. Yet here lies a major problem: Egyptian records make no mention of the Exodus. Pharaohs loved recording their victories on stone walls, but defeats or embarrassments, those were almost never written down. If a group of slaves fled, silence would have been the official response. Still, there are clues. Archaeological digs show that Semitic populations did live in Egypt's eastern delta, the very region the Bible describes. Some researchers believe smaller groups may have slipped away during times of political chaos, later remembered and retold as one great national story. The route of the Exodus is another puzzle. The Bible speaks of crossing the Red Sea, but the Hebrew phrase Yam Suf can also mean Sea of Reeds, possibly referring to shallow lakes and marshes in the eastern Nile delta. Strong winds and seasonal shifts could, in theory, expose land for crossing, later remembered as a miraculous parting of the waters. One of the most tantalizing pieces of evidence comes from the Merneptah Stele, an inscription from around 1208 BCE. It contains the earliest known reference to Israel outside the Bible, describing them as a people already living in Canaan. This means that by the late 13th century BCE, Israel existed as a group, but how they got there remains a mystery. Some scholars propose that the Exodus story reflects not one single event, but generations of experiences, Semitic laborers, small groups of escapees, natural disasters, and clashes with Pharaoh's power, all woven into a collective memory of liberation. So, did the Exodus happen exactly as written? Probably not. But was there an origin story rooted in real migrations, struggles, and survival? Almost certainly. The Exodus may not be one event in history, but it is history told through the lens of faith and identity. Section 5, Moses and the Law. At the center of the Exodus story stands Moses, a prophet, a liberator, and the man who dared to confront Pharaoh himself. According to the Bible, he not only led the Israelites out of bondage but also became the lawgiver, receiving the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, rules that shaped not just religion, but civilization itself. But who was Moses? Was he a real historical figure, or a legendary symbol of leadership and law? Some scholars believe Moses could have been based on an actual leader who guided a group of Semitic people out of Egypt during the turmoil of the New Kingdom. Egypt at the time faced invasions, plagues, and power struggles, conditions ripe for an exodus of oppressed groups. A charismatic leader like Moses could easily have become the nucleus of an epic story. Others suggest Moses was a composite character, an embodiment of collective memory, designed to personify liberation and divine justice. His story may have drawn on the experiences of many leaders over generations, distilled into one towering figure. Then there is the law itself. The Ten Commandments stand as one of the most enduring moral codes in history. But they weren't unique to Israel. Centuries earlier, in Mesopotamia, King Hammurabi carved his famous code of laws into stone, laying down rules about justice, property, and punishment. Egyptian wisdom texts, too, spoke of order, maat, justice, and the responsibility of rulers to protect the weak. What sets Moses apart is not that he brought law, but that his law was framed as coming directly from God, a covenant binding an entire people to their deity, not just rules issued by a king. This transformed law into something sacred, inseparable from identity and faith. The story of Moses also resonates with Egypt itself. Some scholars have noticed parallels between Moses' birth story, hidden as an infant and placed in a basket on the Nile, and Egyptian tales of royal children destined for greatness. Could the biblical writers have drawn on Egyptian cultural motifs to frame Moses as a leader chosen by destiny? Whether Moses was real or symbolic, his role as lawgiver gave the Israelites more than freedom, it gave them unity, identity, and purpose. And in doing so, his story helped shape the foundations of Western morality, justice, and religion. Section 6, Egypt's role in the Bible. Egypt is more than just the backdrop of Exodus, it is a recurring character throughout the entire Bible. Time and again, the land of the Nile appears as a place of refuge, of temptation, of power, and of warning. In the book of Genesis, long before Moses, Abraham journeys to Egypt during a famine, seeking food and survival. Later, Joseph's rise to power in Pharaoh's court turns Egypt into a place of both suffering and salvation, where the Israelites eventually settle. The prophets, too, frequently invoke Egypt. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel warn Israel not to rely on Egyptian military might when threatened by empires like Assyria and Babylon. Egypt is portrayed as both an alluring ally and a dangerous snare, powerful, but ultimately unreliable. Even in the New Testament, Egypt makes a dramatic appearance. When King Herod seeks to kill the infant Jesus, Mary and Joseph flee with him to Egypt. For early Christians, this exile carried deep symbolism. Just as God once delivered Israel from Egypt in the Exodus, now Egypt becomes a place of protection for the Messiah himself. But Egypt's role wasn't only symbolic. The Israelites lived on the borders of great empires. Egypt was the superpower of the ancient Near East for centuries, and its culture, politics, and religion left lasting marks. Egyptian words, ideas, and even art influenced early Israelite society, though often in ways hidden beneath the surface. For biblical writers, Egypt embodied both the greatness of human civilization and the dangers of idolatry and oppression. It was the empire that enslaved, the power that tempted, but also the land that, at times, sheltered and saved. This dual role, both refuge and oppressor, gave Egypt a unique place in the biblical imagination. It was more than geography. It was a symbol, a reminder of the struggle between freedom and bondage, faith and empire, God and Pharaoh. Section 7, Fact or Myth. So, where does that leave us? Were the Bible's stories of Egypt literal history, or powerful myths, shaped over centuries? On one hand, we find striking echoes of truth. Semitic peoples did live in Egypt. Foreigners did rise to positions of power, just as Joseph's story describes. Natural disasters and plagues were real and terrifying events. Archaeological finds, like the city of Pi-Ramesses, align with the Bible's details about Israelite labor. And the Merneptah stele proves that Israel existed as a people not long after the time Exodus is traditionally set. Yet, the gaps are just as striking. There is no Egyptian record of plagues, no mention of Moses, and no inscription of a mass escape. The sweeping, cinematic exodus of hundreds of thousands may never have happened. Instead, what we might be seeing is memory transformed, fragments of real history, slavery, migration, disaster, woven together into a grand national epic of faith and freedom. For believers, these stories remain sacred truth, pointing to a God who delivers and redeems. For historians, they are cultural memory, shaped by centuries of retelling and reinterpretation. For both, they reveal something deeper, how humans use story to explain suffering, hope, and identity. Perhaps the real power of these accounts is not whether every detail happened exactly as written, but how they inspired generations to find meaning in struggle and to believe in liberation against impossible odds. Egypt and the Bible remain forever linked. For believers, these stories are sacred truth. For historians, they're a blend of memory, myth, and history written in the sands of time. One thing is certain, Egypt's shadow looms large over the Bible, shaping some of humanity's greatest stories. If you enjoyed this journey into history and legend, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries of the ancient world.